Heroes get summoned to save the world. 6 mages leaned over him, waiting for a great warrior. Then the scroll above the altar spelled out his gift: 99% discount on land. The first thing Im Dohyeon felt was cold marble under his back. No armor, no sword, no glowing aura. He sat up and his brain did what it always did. It calculated. This marble runs 400,000 won per square meter. This hall holds 600 square meters, 250 million just in flooring. Then he caught himself. Won does not exist here, wherever here is. A man in a crown glared at him from across the hall, like he ordered a war horse and got a donkey. His name was Aldrich Weimar, Crown Prince of Vindmar. He told Dohyeon the kingdom spent 14 months preparing the ritual. The last summoned hero slew 3 demon generals in his first year. Dohyeon nodded politely and asked to see a map, preferably one with property lines. They dragged him to the altar of summoning instead, a black pedestal of pulsing runes. He pressed his hands to the stone, and the runes flared white. A scroll unrolled in the air with a hiss. Gift classification: passive economic. Designation: 99% discount on land. The silence held 3 full seconds. Then the short mage in gold spectacles broke down, laughing so hard he leaned on his staff. The prince turned away and pressed his fingers to his temples. The herald quietly rolled up his welcome speech. But Dohyeon read the words floating in his mind, and his hands started shaking. Not from fear, from the excitement he felt the day he signed his first office lease in Gangnam. Any official land purchase. 1% of registry price. Irrevocable. He understood exactly what he held. Every piece of land on this continent had a price. He could buy all of it for 1%. They tossed him a pouch of 100 gold and called it a hero stipend. A joke. A decent sword cost 80. They expected him to crawl back broke in a month. A gray-robed counselor walked him through the basics. 7 kingdoms. The Great Land Code, every plot registered, every price updated quarterly. Land almost never sold because old houses held it for generations and armies backed their claims. Dohyeon asked about fees and transfer taxes and reassessment rules. The counselor answered slow, like he talked to a child. 3% registration, 2% transfer. War drops prices. Plague cuts a province valuation in half. Dohyeon filed every number. His gift covered the purchase price itself. A 10,000 gold property would cost him 100 for the land, plus 500 in fees. 6% of market value. In Seoul, that would be a crime. Here, it was a divine gift. He walked the capital for 2 days and mapped it like a Seoul neighborhood. He paid 2 silver for the public registry of the 3 nearest provinces. The clerk barely looked up. Nobody reads registries because the print is small, and property law takes years to learn. Dohyeon had 10 years of it. Same principles, different world. He read it by candlelight. Province of Lin. 87 baronies. 14 marked in red ink. Red means distressed. Owner dead or in debt or in dispute. In Seoul, the sharks would circle within hours. Here, nobody cared, because land without an army is land you cannot hold. But Dohyeon did not need an army. He needed a signature. He found Lindholm on the 3rd day. He hitched a ride south with a grain merchant who talked the whole way. Baron Fenholt drank himself into ruin. His wife left. His heir joined the church. The quarry got stripped of marble and abandoned. Listed at 10,000 gold. Worth nothing. 6 months on the market. No buyers. Then Dohyeon asked about the river. A shallow ford, the only crossing between the trade cities of Cornwall and Ost. 40 to 50 wagons a week, and the drunk baron charged nothing. Dohyeon ran the math and went quiet. The baron was exactly what he expected. Large, soft, red-faced, drowning in old wine in a manner that smelled of damp wood. Dohyeon sat across from him and did what he did best. He listened. He let the man drink through half a bottle and complain about the quarry and his debts and his ungrateful son. Then he made his offer. 90 gold. The baron stared. The registry said 10,000. 90 was an insult. Dohyeon explained, calm and flat. The quarry is dead. The manor needs repairs worth more than the land. Take 90 and live a year in the capital, or watch the crown seize it for unpaid taxes and get nothing. The baron raged through every stage of grief in 10 minutes. He begged for 150. Dohyeon said 90. 120. 90. He slammed the table and called Dohyeon a thief. Dohyeon waited. The baron buried his face in his hands and whispered, "Fine." At the guild office the next morning, Dohyeon triggered his gift for the first time. A warm pulse hit his chest. The seal recognized the deal. The contract glowed at the edges. His 90 dropped below the 1% floor, so the gift bumped it up to the minimum. 100 gold, 5 in fees, 105 total. He had 108. He handed over the coins and walked out with 3 gold and a barony. 2 villages, 1 dead quarry, 1 manor that smelled like wine, and 1 river ford between 2 trade cities that nobody was charging for. He walked to the ford that afternoon, wider than he expected, shallow water over gravel, a natural bottleneck. 3 wagons crossing at midday. He counted and ran the numbers. Half a gold a week from the ford alone. Income on day 1 with 0 investment. He hired the baron's old servant Henrik and told him to sit by the water from dawn to dusk and collect 1 copper per wagon. Henrik asked what stops the merchants from refusing.
Dohyeon said nothing stops them today. But by next week, a rope crosses the ford, and a sign reads, "Toll crossing." And a polite notice explains, the alternative route adds 4 days. Henrik went to find rope. That evening, Dohyeon sat alone in the dusty study and spread the registry across the desk. His finger traced the map. Lindholm here. The ford here. The quarry here. And below the quarry, a faded geological note nobody had read in 20 years. Marble exhausted above the 40-foot line. Below that, the stone turns granite-bearing. Granite. He leaned back. The crown was commissioning border fortifications along the eastern frontier. Fortifications eat stone. Granite prices had jumped 12% because the northern quarries were locked in a noble dispute. Dohyeon owned a quarry everyone called dead because the marble was gone. But marble was only the top layer. Granite waited underneath. And he bought the whole thing for 105 gold. He looked out at the dark village. 3 gold in his pocket, a crumbling manor, a rope across a ford, and under his feet enough granite to build a fortress. He let himself feel something close to joy for 1 moment. Then he pulled out a blank sheet and started writing numbers. There was work to do. The first wagon master who refused to pay the toll was a wide-shouldered man named Grieven, who hauled salted fish between Cornwall and Ost. He rode up to the ford on the 4th morning and found a rope stretched across the crossing, and old Henrik sitting on a stool with a collection box. Grieven laughed and asked who put a rope across a free crossing. Henrik told him the new Baron of Lindholm. Grieven said there was no new Baron of Lindholm. Henrik showed him the stamped deed. Grieven read it slowly, and his smile disappeared. He asked how much. 1 copper per wagon. Grieven said that was robbery. Henrik pointed out that 1 copper was less than the cost of the oats his horses would eat on a 4-day detour. Grieven paid the copper and crossed. He was the last person to argue about it that week. Dohyeon spent the first week after the purchase doing what any good property owner does before investing. He walked every inch of it. He walked the 2 villages. Lindholm proper had 32 houses and about 160 people. The second village, called Darren, sat a half-hour north and had 19 houses and maybe 90 people. Both were in bad shape. Roofs patched with whatever was available, gardens overgrown, a mill with a cracked grinding stone that nobody had money to replace. The people looked at him the way tenants looked at a new landlord everywhere in every world.
Fear first, then calculation, then the careful, neutral expression that meant they were waiting to see whether he would make things worse. Dohyeon understood that expression. He had seen it in Seoul 100 times when he walked prospective buyers through buildings where people still lived. He told the village heads the same thing he would have told anxious tenants. Nothing changes today. Your rent stays the same. Your homes stay yours. I am not here to squeeze. I am here to build. They nodded and did not believe him, and that was fine. Belief would come later. The quarry was a 20-minute walk east of Lindholm village. It was a wide cut in a hillside, about 60 feet across and 30 feet deep. The marble had been carved out in clean terraces that stepped down to a flat floor of gray stone. Tools lay scattered where the last workers had dropped them months ago. A wooden crane stood tilted at the edge, with a frayed rope and a rusted winch. Dohyeon climbed down to the quarry floor and knelt and ran his hand along the stone. It was gray, dense, cool to the touch. He was not a geologist, but he had spent enough time on construction sites to know the difference between decorative stone and structural stone. This was structural.
He picked up a loose chunk and carried it back to the manor.
That evening, he wrote a letter to the Guild of Surveyors requesting an updated geological assessment of the Lindholm quarry site. The fee was 8 silver. He had 3 gold. He paid it. The assessor arrived 6 days later. A young man named Peter, with ink stains on his fingers and a leather case full of instruments. He spent 2 days at the quarry, taking samples and measurements and scratching notes in a journal. On the 3rd day, he sat across from Dohyeon in the manor study and delivered his report. The marble deposits were fully exhausted, as expected. But below the marble layer, at a depth of approximately 42 feet, the stone transitioned to a high-density gray granite formation. Based on the visible cross-section and standard geological modeling, the deposit was estimated at roughly 12,000 cubic yards of extractable granite before reaching the water table. Dohyeon asked what 12,000 cubic yards of granite was worth at current market prices. Peter did the calculation on paper. At current rates of 14 silver per cubic yard for rough-cut granite, and assuming 60% extraction efficiency, the total extractable value was approximately 100,000 gold. Dohyeon kept his face perfectly still. 100,000 gold. He had paid 105 for the entire barony. Peter noticed his expression, or lack of it, and added that extraction costs would be significant. Labor, equipment, transport. Realistically, the profit margin on granite was about 30% after all costs. So about 30,000 gold over the life of the quarry. Dohyeon thanked him and paid his fee and walked him to the door and stood in the doorway for a full minute after the assessor left, just breathing. 30,000 gold. Over maybe 10 to 15 years of extraction. That was 2,000 to 3,000 gold per year in profit. The entire barony of Lindholm had generated maybe 200 gold per year at its peak under the old baron. Dohyeon had just increased the theoretical output tenfold. But theoretical was not real. He needed workers. He needed equipment. He needed a buyer. And he had exactly 1 gold and 4 silver left. The Ford was bringing in about half a gold per week. At that rate, it would take months to accumulate enough capital to restart the quarry. Months he might not have. The quarterly reassessment was in 7 weeks. If the guild updated the Lindholm registry price based on the new geological survey, it would jump from the current 10,000 to maybe 50 or 60,000. That was good for his net worth on paper, but bad for his next move. Because his next move was to buy the barony next door. The barony of Særgard sat directly east of Lindholm. It was listed in the registry at 8,000 gold, and also marked in red. Distressed. The story was common in this region. Baron Særgard had been a minor nobleman, with a decent estate, and a daughter he loved. He had borrowed heavily to give her a proper education, and a proper dowry. Then the grain prices collapsed 2 years ago, and his income dried up, and the lenders came calling. And he started drinking to manage the panic, and the drinking made everything worse. He had been trying to sell for 3 months,
But Sergard had no quarry, no ford, no strategic value. Just farmland and a nice house and a small forest. Nobody was buying. Dohyeon learned all this from the grain merchant, who had given him a ride on the first day. Merchants knew everything about everyone, because merchants talked and listened and moved between places. Better intelligence network than any spy ring. Dohyeon needed money to buy Sergard, and money to restart the quarry. He could not do both with what he had. So he did what any good businessman does when capital is short. He found a partner. The word partner made his stomach clench. The last partner he had trusted had stolen everything and left him to die on a Seoul sidewalk. But this was not Seoul, and he was not the same man. Or maybe he was exactly the same man, and that was the problem. He shoved the thought away and focused on the math. He needed a buyer for granite who would pay in advance, a contract for future delivery. In Seoul, they called it a forward contract. Here, they probably called it something else, but the principle was the same. Promise stone now, get paid now, deliver later. He rode to Cornwall on a borrowed mule. Cornwall was the larger of the two trade cities connected by his ford. It had a population of about 12,000 and a busy market district, and more importantly, it had a crown procurement office. The Eastern Fortifications Project was being managed by the Royal Corps of Engineers, based in the capital, but procurement was distributed through regional offices. Dohyeon walked into the Cornwall procurement office and asked to speak with whoever was buying stone. He was directed to a tired-looking official named Brennan, who sat behind a desk piled with requisition forms. Dohyeon introduced himself as Baron of Lindholm. Brennan looked unimpressed. Dohyeon told him he had a granite quarry with a confirmed geological survey showing 12,000 cubic yards of high-density gray granite. Brennan looked slightly more interested. Dohyeon told him he could begin deliveries within 3 months at 12 silver per cubic yard, 2 silver below current market rate. Brennan sat up straight. The Crown was paying 14 silver per yard from the northern quarries, and those quarries were delayed by the noble contract dispute. 12 silver was a significant saving. Brennan asked how many yards per month. Dohyeon said he could guarantee 200 per month to start, with scaling up to 400 within 6 months. Brennan did quick math. 200 yards at 12 silver was 2,400 silver per month. 24 gold. That was real money for a regional office trying to stay on budget. He asked for a sample and proof of survey. Dohyeon handed him the geological report and the chunk of granite he had carried from the quarry. Brennan turned the stone in his hands. He asked about transport. Dohyeon said the quarry was 2 days from Cornwall by wagon road, and he would handle delivery. Brennan said he would need approval from the capital office, but if everything checked out, he could issue a forward contract with a 50% advance on the first 3 months of delivery. Dohyeon kept his voice level and said that would be acceptable. The contract came through in 9 days. 50% advance on 3 months at 200 yards per month. That was 36 gold in advance. Plus, Dohyeon negotiated a bonus clause for early delivery and a penalty waiver for the first month. The 36 gold arrived in a locked chest carried by 2 crown soldiers. Dohyeon signed the receipt and locked the chest in the manor strongroom. He had 36 gold. The ford was generating about 2 gold a month now because word had spread that the crossing was monitored and merchants were adjusting their timing to cross in groups. 38 gold total working capital. The quarry restart would cost about 15 gold for basic equipment and initial labor. That left 23 gold. Sergard was listed at 8,000 in the registry. 1% was 80 gold. He was short. But Dohyeon had not survived 10 years in Seoul real estate by waiting until he had enough money. He survived by finding sellers desperate enough to go below registry. He visited Baron Sergard on a Tuesday afternoon. The manor was nicer than Lindholm. Stone walls, a garden that had once been beautiful. Inside, it smelled like dust and regret. Baron Sergard was a thin man with hollow eyes who looked 20 years older than he probably was. He sat in a parlor that had been stripped of most of its furniture, sold piece by piece to cover debts. His daughter was not home. She was in town trying to sell embroidery. The baron of a noble house, his heir selling needlework in the market. Dohyeon sat across from him and listened to the same story he had heard from Finholt, but sadder because Sergard was not angry. He was defeated. He spoke about his daughter in a tone that made it clear she was the only thing he still cared about. He had borrowed against the estate to fund her education and a marriage that fell apart when the money dried up. The groom had withdrawn. The daughter, Cho Serin, had come home to a bankrupt house and a broken father, and had been holding the pieces together with her bare hands for 2 years. Dohyeon made his offer, 23 gold for the barony of Sergard. The baron did not laugh the way Finholt had. He just stared at the table. 23 gold for 8,000 gold of land. It was not even an insult. It was an obituary. But the baron knew what Dohyeon knew. The quarterly reassessment was coming. Sergard had produced nothing. The debts were growing. The crown could seize the estate for back taxes within 2 quarters. 23 gold now was 23 gold more than 0. The baron asked one thing. He asked that his daughter be allowed to keep the family house. Not the estate, not the land, just the house she grew up in. Dohyeon looked at him for a long moment. Then he pulled out a blank contract and wrote something that surprised even himself. He wrote a separate deed, a gift deed, granting Cho Serin lifelong ownership of the Sergard family residence and the garden attached to it, independent of the estate sale. Her property, not his. He signed it and slid it across the table. The baron read it twice. His hands trembled. He signed the sale agreement. Sergard was sold. The guild clerk processed it the next day. Purchase price adjusted by the gift. 1% of 8,000. 80 gold. But the seller had agreed to 23 gold, which was below the 1% minimum. The gift activated at the actual payment amount. 23 gold. Registration and transfer fees calculated on the registry price came to 400 gold. Dohyeon froze. He had not accounted for the fees being based on registry price rather than purchase price. 400 gold in fees. He had 23 gold total. He sat in the clerk office and felt the ground open under him. Then the clerk coughed and mentioned that fee payment could be deferred for new barons consolidating adjacent properties under a provision of the Land Code Article 7, Section 12. Deferred for 1 quarter, with interest. Dohyeon asked the interest rate. The clerk said 5% per quarter. Dohyeon exhaled. 20 gold in deferred fees on a 400 gold obligation. He could manage that if the quarry came through. He signed the deferral. He walked out of the guild office as the owner of 2 baronies, Lindholm and Sergard. 4 villages, 1 quarry, 1 ford, 1 crumbling manor, and 1 nice one, and a debt of 400 gold due in 3 months. He went back to the Sergard manor to begin the transition. Henrik was managing the ford. The quarry workers he had hired with the first 10 gold of the crown advance were already clearing rubble and setting up scaffolding. The quarry would produce its first granite block within a month if everything held. He had a plan. It was tight. It was risky. It was exactly the kind of deal that had built his agency in Seoul, and exactly the kind of deal that had destroyed it. The difference was that this time, the only partner he had to trust was himself. He found Cho Serin in the Sergard kitchen. She was 22. Dark hair pulled back. Sharp eyes behind a calm face. She was standing at the table with a ledger open in front of her, and she was doing the household accounts with a quill that moved fast and sure. She looked up when he entered, and her expression went from neutral to stone. She knew who he was, the man who had bought her home for 23 gold. She asked if he had come to inspect his property. Her voice was flat and precise. Dohyeon looked at the ledger on the table. The quarry produced its first block of granite on the 19th day after Dohyeon hired the crew. It was a rough-cut slab, about 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, and it took 6 men and a repaired crane to lift it out of the pit. Dohyeon stood at the rim and watched it come up, and felt nothing poetic about the moment. He felt math. 1 block of roughly finished granite was about 1.2 cubic yards. At 12 silver per yard, that was 14 silver and 4 coppers per block. He needed to produce 5 blocks a day to meet the Crown contract minimum of 200 yards per month. Right now, they were doing 1 block every 2 days. He needed to triple the workforce and get a second crane built, and find a teamster willing to haul stone to Cornwall at a rate that did not eat all his margin. He had 2 months before the first delivery was due, and 3 months before the 400 gold in deferred fees would crush him. The labor problem solved itself in a way he did not expect. Word had gotten around the 2 villages that the new baron was hiring at the quarry. Dohyeon was paying 3 coppers a day per laborer, which was below the city rate of 5 coppers, but above the nothing that these men had been earning for the past year. Within a week, he had 20 men showing up at the quarry each morning. Within 2 weeks, he had 30. The problem was not bodies, it was skill. Quarrying granite was harder than quarrying marble. The stone was denser.
The cuts had to be more precise. The old marble workers knew their trade, but granite was different, and the learning curve was steep. Blocks cracked, chisels broke, the crane rope snapped on the 9th day, and a half-finished block tumbled back into the pit and shattered. Dohyeon lost 3 days of work and 2 silver in replacement rope. He found the solution in the second village of Darren. An old man named Oscar had spent 40 years cutting granite in the northern quarries before retiring to his daughter house in Darren. His hands were gnarled and his back was bent, but his eyes were sharp, and when Dohyeon described the problems at the quarry, Oscar told him exactly what was wrong without even visiting the site. They were cutting against the grain. Granite had a natural fracture pattern called the rift, and if you cut with the rift instead of against it, the stone split clean and fast. Dohyeon offered him a job, not as a laborer, as a foreman. 15 coppers a day, 5 times the standard rate. Oscar said he was too old to swing a hammer. Dohyeon said he did not need him to swing anything. He needed him to stand at the top and tell the young ones where to hit. Oscar accepted. Within a week, production doubled. Within 2 weeks, they were doing 4 blocks a day. Not quite 5, but close enough to make Dohyeon breathe easier. The transport issue was thornier. Cornwall was 2 days by wagon road, and the road was bad. Deep ruts from years of neglect. Mud in wet weather. A wagon loaded with granite blocks could make the trip in 2 days under good conditions, or 4 under bad. Dohyeon needed a regular schedule. He hired 3 teamsters from Cornwall at a rate of 2 silver per trip, and committed to a minimum of 4 trips per month. That was 8 silver per month in transport costs. His margin on 200 yards of granite at 12 silver per yard was 2,400 silver revenue minus about 1,600 in labor and materials and transport. 800 silver profit per month. 8 gold. It was not enough. The deferred fees of 400 gold were due in 10 weeks. 8 gold per month for 2.5 months was 20 gold. He would be 380 gold short. Saren found the answer. She came to the Lindholm Manor on a Thursday evening with the provincial registry open to a section Dohyeon had not studied yet, tax lien properties. In Ervin, when a landowner failed to pay crown taxes for more than 2 years, the land entered a special status. It was not yet seized, but it was marked for public auction. The auction price started at the outstanding tax debt, not the registry value. If nobody bid, the crown took possession. But the auctions were rarely attended because they were announced only in the Guild of Surveyors bulletin board in the provincial capital, and most people who could afford land had agents watching the board for them. Saren had been watching the board for her father for years out of habit, even after the bankruptcy. She knew which properties were coming up. There were 3 tax lien auctions scheduled in the next 6 weeks. 2 were garbage, flooded pasture and a collapsed farmhouse, but the third was interesting. A small estate called Thornfeld, about an hour north of Lindholm. It included a stretch of woodland and a hilltop ruin that had once been a watchtower. Assessed at 2,000 gold, tax debt outstanding was 60 gold. The auction would start at 60 gold. Nobody would bid because Thornfeld had no obvious value. Woodland without timber rights and a broken tower. But Saren had done her research. The timber rights for Thornfeld had been sold separately 20 years ago to a logging company that had since gone bankrupt. Under the land code, when a rights holder ceased to exist, the rights reverted to the landowner. Nobody had bothered to update the registry. If Dohyeon bought Thornfeld at auction, the timber rights would revert to him automatically. That woodland was old-growth oak and pine, mature timber worth at least 300 gold if properly harvested. Dohyeon looked at her across the table. She looked back without expression. He asked how long she had been sitting on this information. She said since her father went bankrupt 2 years ago. She had planned to buy Thornfeld herself if she ever had the money. She never did. Dohyeon asked why she was telling him instead of keeping it for herself. She said because he was paying her 50 silver a month and she was not a thief. There it was again. That word. Thief.
In a world where everyone stole from everyone, this woman treated honesty like it was structural. Like a load-bearing wall. Take it out, and the building falls. Dohyeon told her they would go to the auction together, and if the deal worked, her pay would go to 1 gold per month, starting immediately. She nodded once and went back to her ledger. The auction took place in the guild office in the town of Ferrisport, which served as the provincial seat for Lin. The room was small and smelled like old paper. 3 guild clerks sat behind a table. 2 other bidders had shown up. One was a merchant looking at the flooded pasture for some reason Dohyeon could not fathom. The other was an agent for a minor lord interested in the collapsed farmhouse for its stone. Nobody else. Thornfeld came up third. The clerk read the listing. Small estate, woodland, 1 ruined structure. Outstanding tax debt, 60 gold. Starting bid, 60 gold. Dohyeon raised his hand. 60 gold. No other bids. The clerk waited the required 30 seconds. No hands. Sold. Dohyeon signed the papers. Gift activated. 1% of the 2,000 gold registry value. 20 gold. Plus auction fees of 3 gold. 23 gold total. Saren stood beside him and watched the seal flare on the contract and said nothing, but her eyes were wide. She had never seen a seal activate. Nobody activated seals for 23 gold purchases. The magic was designed for kingdom-level transactions. Watching it flare for a ruined watchtower and some trees was like watching a dragon light a candle. Dohyeon now owned 3 properties: Lindholm, Sergard, Thornfeld. The timber at Thornfeld needed to be harvested and sold fast. He hired a crew of 12 woodcutters from Ferrisport at the going rate and set them to work on the most accessible stands of oak. Oak was in demand everywhere. Ships, buildings, furniture, barrels. The first load went to market in Cornwall within 2 weeks. 40 logs of old-growth oak. The timber merchant who bought them paid 2 gold per log. 80 gold. Dohyeon immediately put 60 gold toward the deferred registration fees. 340 remaining. The second load came 2 weeks later. Another 70 gold. He paid another 70. 270 remaining. The quarry was now producing 5 blocks a day. The first delivery to the crown went on schedule. Brennan, at the procurement office, signed the receipt and released the next month advance. Dohyeon fed the gold straight into the fee debt. The numbers were converging. Tight, but converging. 3 things happened in the 7th week that changed the shape of his plans. The first was a letter from the Guild of Surveyors informing him that due to his acquisition of 3 adjacent properties in the province of Lin, he was now eligible for the title of Viscount under the Consolidated Holdings provision of the Land Code. The title was automatic upon registration and carried with it the right to maintain a household guard of up to 20 armed men and to collect a provincial trade levy of 0.5% on goods passing through his combined territories. Dohyeon read the letter twice. A trade levy. 0.5% on all goods through his land. That included the ford. That included the road from Thornfeld to Cornwall that his timber wagons were already using, and that other merchants were starting to use because it was shorter than the main highway. 0.5% was not much per transaction, but across hundreds of wagons per month, it added up. He registered the title the same day. The second thing was the arrival of the guild inspector. Saren had warned him this would happen. When a new landowner acquired multiple properties in quick succession, the guild sent someone to verify that everything was in order. The inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning. She was a woman in her late 20s, with sharp features and round spectacles, and the bearing of someone who had never been wrong about a number in her life. Her name was Sun Hae-yoon,
and she was the head of the Guild Surveyor Office for the province of Lin. She was not supposed to do inspections personally. That was below her rank. But the case of Baron Im, who was now Viscount Im, had apparently caught her attention. Dohyeon met her at the Lindholm Manor and offered her tea, which she declined, and a seat, which she took reluctantly. She opened a leather folder and began asking questions. When did he arrive in Erevin? Where did he obtain his initial funds? How did he afford the purchase of 3 properties in under 2 months on 100 gold stipend? Her tone was not hostile. It was precise. Every question was a scalpel. Dohyeon answered everything truthfully. He told her about the gift. She asked to see it demonstrated.
He said it only activated during an actual purchase, and he was not buying anything today. She frowned and made a note. He showed her the contracts, all properly stamped, all properly sealed. She examined each one with a magnifying lens and found nothing irregular. She reviewed his financial records, which Seirin had prepared in meticulous detail. Income from Ford tolls, income from granite sales, timber revenue, all documented, all taxed. She spent 4 hours in the manor going through every document. At the end, she closed her folder and looked at him and said that everything appeared to be in order. Ashley Rhine did not talk much in the first week. She moved into the small gatehouse at the Lindholm Manor entrance and kept her horse in the stable and her sword within arm reach at all times. She ate alone. She patrolled the property twice a day on a route she designed herself. She positioned herself between Dohyeon and every door he walked through. Seirin did not like her. The tension between them was immediate and silent. Seirin saw a stranger with a sword who had arrived by killing someone on the road. Ashley saw a clerk with sharp eyes who knew too much about the man she was guarding. They circled each other like territorial cats for the first 3 days, until Dohyeon sat them both down and told them that he was paying both of them, and he expected both of them to make him money, not headaches. Seirin opened her ledger. Ashley went back to the gatehouse. The circling continued, but quieter. The assassination attempt changed things. Dohyeon had known abstractly that buying land in a feudal world would make enemies. Now he knew it concretely. Someone had paid to have him killed. He did not know who. The dead assassin carried nothing useful. No documents, no insignia, just a knife and 10 silver coins, and a bad attitude that Ashley had resolved permanently. Dohyeon spent 2 days thinking about who would want him dead already. He was a minor viscount with 3 small properties. He was not yet a threat to anyone important, which meant either someone was watching him more carefully than he realized, or the threat was local. A neighboring lord who did not want competition, a merchant who did not want to pay the Ford toll, a creditor of one of the barons he had bought out. The list was long and useless without information. He focused on what he could control: money. The deferred fees were being paid down steadily. Timber from Thornfeld was bringing in 60 to 70 gold per month. The quarry was meeting contract quotas. The Ford and trade levy combined were generating about 5 gold per month. His total monthly income was now approaching 100 gold. His expenses were about 40. Labor, materials, transport, Ashley's salary, Seirin's salary, Henrik at the Ford, the woodcutting crew, food and supplies for the manor. Net profit of roughly 60 gold per month. The remaining deferred fees would be cleared within 2 months, well before the deadline. He was solvent. Barely, but solvent. Now he needed to grow. The provincial registry listed 11 more distressed properties in the Lin province. Seirin had ranked them by potential value and flagged 3 as priority targets. The first was a barony called Marindale on the western edge of Lin. It sat on a major crossroads where the north-south highway met the east-west trade route. The barony included a village of about 200 people and a large inn that had been the main rest stop for long-distance merchants for decades. The baron had died 8 months ago without an heir, and the estate was tied up in a succession dispute between 2 distant cousins who both lived in the capital, and neither of whom had ever visited Marindale. The property was frozen. No one was maintaining the inn. No one was collecting the crossroads tolls. The village was slowly dying. Registry price 15,000 gold. With his gift, that was 150 gold. But he could not buy it until the succession dispute was resolved, and one of the cousins was named legal owner and agreed to sell.
Saren suggested a different approach. Under the land code, a property frozen in succession dispute could be released for sale if all claimants agreed to a joint sale. The proceeds would then be divided according to the final succession ruling. It was an obscure provision. Saren had found it in Appendix 7 of the code while researching something else. All Dohyeon needed was to get both cousins to agree. He wrote 2 letters, identical content. Each one explained that the property was deteriorating, that every month of dispute reduced its value, that he was prepared to offer immediate payment at a fair price, and both parties would receive their share once the court ruled. He sent the letters by courier and waited. While he waited, he dealt with the quarry expansion. Oscar the foreman had suggested opening a second cutting face on the east side of the pit. This would double capacity, but required a significant investment in new equipment, a second crane, more tools, shoring timber for the deeper cuts. Dohyeon estimated the cost at about 50 gold. He did not have 50 gold to spare right now, but he would within a month if the timber sales held. He approved the expansion and told Oscar to start the preliminary work with what they had. The response from the Marindale cousins came 10 days later. Both letters arrived on the same day. Cousin 1 said yes immediately. He was a wine merchant in the capital who had no interest in a rural barony and wanted cash. Cousin 2 was more difficult. She was a minor noblewoman married to a magistrate, and she wanted the property on principle because it carried a title. She did not want to sell. She wanted to win the dispute and become Baroness of Marindale. Dohyeon wrote her a second letter. He pointed out that the dispute could take 2 to 3 more years in the courts, that the property value would drop with each quarterly reassessment, that the inn was losing customers to a rival establishment on an alternate route, that by the time she won the title, if she won the title, the barony would be worth half its current value. He offered her a sweetener. If she agreed to the joint sale, he would pay her a premium of 1,000 gold above her share of the proceeds. A personal payment, not part of the land deal. She wrote back in 4 days. She agreed. The Marindale purchase closed 3 weeks later. Registry price 15,000 gold. Gift price 150 gold. Fees totaling 750 gold deferred under the same adjacent property consolidation provision. Total immediate cost 150 gold. He had the money from the quarry and timber. He signed the papers. The seal flared. He now owned 4 properties in the province of Lin. 4 baronies, 6 villages, 1 quarry, 1 ford, 1 stretch of woodland, 1 major crossroads with an inn, and a title of Viscount that was starting to mean something. Dohyeon put Ashley and 3 hired guards on the road to Marindale within a day of the purchase. The inn needed to reopen immediately. It was the most visible revenue source. A crossroads inn on a major trade route could generate 10 to 15 gold per month easily. He hired a local woman named Marta, who had been the inn head cook before the Baron died, and gave her authority to hire staff and purchase supplies and reopen within a week. He set the room rate at 4 coppers per night, which was 2 coppers below the standard rate for a roadside inn. Merchants would come for the price. Once they were coming, he would raise it. Basic hospitality economics. Saren, meanwhile, had turned her attention to the second priority property, a small estate called Vosburg just south of Thornfell. It was not in distress exactly, but its owner was old and tired and had no heirs, and had expressed interest in selling to the right buyer. The right buyer apparently meant someone who would keep the estate chapel maintained, because the old lord was religious. Dohyeon did not care about chapels, but he told Saren to include a clause in the offer guaranteeing maintenance of the estate chapel in perpetuity. Saren gave him a look that said she was noting the gap between what he said and what he did. The offer went out. 2 months in. 5 properties, including the pending Vosburg deal. Monthly income now approaching 140 gold, with the Marindale Inn coming online. Expenses climbing to about 60 gold. Net profit of 80 gold per month and rising. The deferred fees from Sergard were fully paid off. The Marindale fees were on schedule. The quarry was producing at full capacity on one face, and the second face would open within a month.
Timber from Thornfeld would last another 6 months before the harvestable stands were exhausted.
Dohyeon needed new revenue streams before the timber ran out. He found one in the most obvious place, the ford. Henrik had been collecting tolls for 2 months and keeping meticulous records, because Dohyeon had taught him how. The records showed clear patterns. Traffic peaked on market days in Cornwall and Ost. The heaviest loads were grain wagons heading east and finished goods heading west. Average daily crossings had increased from 6 to 12 as more merchants learned that the ford was maintained and safe. 12 wagons at 1 copper each was 12 coppers a day. Decent, but not transformative. The real value of the ford was not the toll. It was the location. Every merchant who crossed the ford passed through Dohyeon land. They saw the quarry. They saw the villages. They heard about the new baron who paid fair wages and kept the roads clear. The ford was advertising.
And advertising was worth more than coppers.
Dohyeon decided to build a way station at the ford, a simple structure, a roof for merchants to rest under, a trough for horses, a small storage shed where goods could be held overnight if a merchant needed to camp. Cost about 8 gold for materials and labor. The way station would be free to use for anyone paying the toll. It was a loss leader, draw merchants in, make the ford the preferred crossing, increase traffic, increase visibility. Then build the next thing. He told Saren about the plan. She asked where the 8 gold was coming from, since their cash reserves were committed to the Marindale fees and the quarry expansion. Dohyeon said he would defer his own pay for 2 months. He was living in the Lindholm Manor and eating food from his own villages, and wearing the same 3 shirts he had arrived in. He did not need gold right now. He needed infrastructure.
Saren wrote it down in the ledger and added a note in the margin that Dohyeon did not see until weeks later.
The note said, "The Viscount has not bought himself a single new shirt." The second assassination attempt came on a warm night 3 months into Dohyeon ownership of Lindholm. He was asleep in the manor when Ashley kicked open his bedroom door and told him to get on the floor. He hit the ground before his brain finished processing the words. Arrows punched through the window shutters and buried themselves in the wall above his bed. 3 arrows, spaced evenly. Professional. Ashley was already moving. She went through the window on the far side of the room and dropped into the garden below. Dohyeon heard shouting, a clash of metal, then silence. He stayed on the floor and counted his heartbeats until Ashley came back through the front door with blood on her sleeve and reported that 2 archers had been positioned in the tree line east of the manor. One was dead.
The other had fled into the woods.
She had not pursued because leaving Dohyeon alone was not acceptable. This time there was evidence. The dead archer carried a small medallion hidden in the lining of his boot. It bore the crest of a crossed key and tower. Saren recognized it immediately. House Valtheim. The oldest noble house in the province of Lin, and one of the oldest in all of Vinmar. Their seat was Valtheim Keep, a massive fortress in the northern highlands of the province. They had held lands in Lin for over 300 years. Lord Marcus Valtheim, the current head of the house, was 60 years old, with silver at his temples and a reputation for absolute conviction that land belonged to noble blood and noble blood alone. He had watched Dohyeon acquire 5 properties in his province without being able to do anything about it because every purchase was legal. But legal and acceptable were different things in the world of old houses. Dohyeon did not panic. He had expected something like this, though he had hoped for more time. He sat down with Saren and Ashley and laid out what they knew. Valtheim had sent assassins. The first attempt had been clumsy, using a freelance killer that even Ashley had found substandard. The second was better, professional archers, a crest hidden but present. Valtheim was testing, seeing how well Dohyeon was protected, seeing if he would run. Ashley said the next attempt would not be arrows. It would be something that looked like an accident, a bridge collapse, a fire, poison. She recommended hiring more guards immediately, at least 10. Dohyeon agreed, but he also saw an opportunity in the threat. He rode to Ferrisport the next day and filed a formal complaint with the Guild of Surveyors against House Waldheim for attempted interference with a registered landowner. Under the Land Code, attacking a property holder for the purpose of forcing a sale or abandonment was a Class 2 offense, punishable by mandatory reassessment of the attacker properties at elevated rates. In plain terms, if Waldheim was found guilty, their own land would be revalued upward by 20% at the next quarterly assessment. That meant higher taxes. Higher taxes on the vast Waldheim holdings would cost them thousands of gold per year. It was a financial weapon disguised as a legal filing. Saren had drafted the complaint. It was 12 pages long and cited 14 provisions of the code. Sun Hyun received it at the guild office and read it in front of them. Her face did not change expression once. When she finished, she looked up and said the complaint would be investigated. She did not say anything else, but something in the way she placed the document in her priority file suggested that she was not displeased to have a case against House Waldheim on her desk. Dohyeon hired 10 guards through a mercenary broker in Cornwall. Not the best available. The best available was Ashley, and she was already taken. But decent men who could hold a wall and stay awake through a night watch. He stationed 5 at Lindholm Manor, and distributed the others across Sergard and Marindale. Monthly cost went up by 20 gold. His net profit dropped from 80 to 60. He accepted the cost. Dead men do not buy land. The legal complaint took 2 weeks to produce results. The guild sent an investigator to Waldheim Keep. Lord Marcus Waldheim received the investigator politely and denied everything. The medallion could have been stolen or planted. He had no knowledge of any attack. He expressed concern for the safety of his neighbor, Viscount Im, and offered to send his own men to help patrol the borders. The offer was declined. The investigation was officially inconclusive, but the complaint remained on file. A mark. The first mark on a 300-year record. Dohyeon had not expected conviction. He had expected exactly this. A public record that House Waldheim had been investigated for attacking a registered landowner. That record would be visible in the guild registry. Every merchant, every banker, every potential partner who looked up House Waldheim would see it. Reputation was a form of property, and Dohyeon had just put a scratch on theirs. Lord Waldheim's response came not through assassins this time, but through the market. 2 weeks after the complaint, Dohyeon received a letter from the Crown Procurement Office in Cornwall. Brennan, the procurement official, informed him with visible discomfort that the granite supply contract was being reviewed due to new bids from competing quarries. A quarry in the Northern Highlands had submitted a bid at 11 silver per cubic yard, 1 silver below Dohyeon's price. Dohyeon did not need to ask who owned the northern quarry. The letter was polite and procedural and devastating. If he lost the crown contract, his cash flow would drop by 30%. He could not match 11 silver. His costs were higher because his quarry was deeper and the transport distance was longer. At 11 silver, he would break even at best. Waldheim was willing to sell granite at a loss just to bleed Dohyeon out. He spent 3 days on the problem. He walked the quarry. He walked the road to Cornwall. He sat in the manor study and stared at numbers until the candle burned down. Then Saren walked in with tea she had not been asked for and a sheet of paper she had been asked for. The paper was a summary of Crown procurement regulations. Buried in Section 19 was a provision that gave preference to local suppliers when bids were within 5% of each other. Dohyeon Quarry was in Lin Province. The crown fortifications being supplied were on the eastern border of Lin Province. The Waldheim Quarry was in the northern highlands, technically in the province of Haldren. If Dohyeon matched the bid at 11 silver per yard, the local preference provision would apply and his contract would be preserved. He could not profit at 11 silver, but he could survive. And survival was enough for now, because the Waldheim Quarry was operating at a loss too, and Waldheim had more to lose. They were burning gold to hurt him. He just had to burn slower. He matched the bid. Brennan looked relieved. The contract was renewed at 11 silver per cubic yard, with the local preference clause noted explicitly in the new terms. Dohyeon net quarry income dropped from 8 gold per month to effectively 0. He was breaking even on granite. The quarry was now a jobs program, not a profit center. But it kept 60 men employed, and it kept stone flowing, and it kept his name on a crown contract, which was worth more than money. It was legitimacy. He needed new income to replace the lost quarry margin. The inn at Marindale was growing. Monthly revenue had climbed to 12 gold as word spread about the low rates and the cook Marta, whose roast lamb was becoming famous on the trade route. Timber from Thornfeld was still producing about 50 gold per month. The Ford and trade levy combined were doing 7 gold per month. Total income without the quarry profit was about 70 gold. Expenses were 60. Net profit of 10 gold per month. Thin. Dangerously thin. One bad month would put him in the red. Dohyeon needed to make a move. A big one. Something that would change the math fundamentally. He pulled out the registry and the map and started looking not at individual properties, but at patterns. Where was the money flowing in Lin province? What roots were growing? What industries were expanding? What was changing? He found it on page 47 of the Quarterly Guild Economic Report that Saren had obtained from the Ferrisport office. A single line in a table of trade volumes. River traffic on the Lin River had increased 40% in the past year. The reason was simple. The Eastern Fortification Project had created massive demand for supplies moving east, and the Lin River was the fastest route from the central provinces to the eastern border. More barges, more goods, more money flowing through the province, and every barge that traveled the Lin River passed through a narrow stretch between two hills about 6 miles south of Linholm village. That stretch was called the Narrows. The land on both sides of the Narrows belonged to a single owner, an elderly widow named Baroness Kessler, who lived alone in a decrepit manor and had not responded to 3 years of tax notices. Dohyeon visited Baroness Kessler on a cool morning. The manor was falling apart. The roof sagged. The garden was wild. The Baroness herself was a tiny woman in her 70s, with white hair and hands that trembled when she poured tea. She poured it anyway because she had manners, and manners did not age. She knew why he was here. Everyone who visited wanted the Narrows. She had turned them all away. The land had been in her family for 6 generations. Her husband had died defending it during a border skirmish 20 years ago. Her sons had both died of fever. She had no heirs. When she died, the land would go to the crown by default. She would rather it go to the crown than to some merchant who would squeeze every copper from the river traders. Dohyeon listened. He drank his tea. He did not make an offer. Instead, he asked about her sons. She talked for 2 hours. He listened for 2 hours. She showed him their rooms, which she had kept exactly as they left them. She showed him the garden where they had played. She showed him the spot on the riverbank where her husband had taught them to fish. Dohyeon looked at all of it and said nothing about money. When the sun began to set, he thanked her for the tea and stood to leave. She asked if he was going to make an offer. He said, not today. She looked surprised. He said he wanted to think about it. She looked more surprised. He left. He came back a week later. He brought with him a document that Saren had helped him draft. It was not a purchase offer. It was a proposal, a land trust, the Kessler Family Trust. Under its terms, the Narrows would be sold to Dohyeon at registry price. The gift would make it affordable. But the trust deed would guarantee 3 things. The manor would be maintained as the Kessler family residence for the Baroness' lifetime. The garden and the fishing spot would be preserved as a memorial. And a portion of the revenue from the Narrows would fund a small school in the nearest village named after the Kessler sons. The Baroness read the document. She read it again. She looked at Dohyeon over her spectacles and asked why he was doing this. He said it was a good investment. She said she was old, not stupid. He looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. He said that he once had something he cared about, and someone took it from him and left him with nothing. and that he did not think anyone should die with the feeling that everything they built disappeared without a trace. The Baroness set down the document. She picked up a pen. She signed. The letter from House Waldheim arrived on a silver tray carried by a rider in gray livery. The rider was young and polite and waited in the Lindholm courtyard while Dohyeon broke the wax seal and read. Lord Marcus Waldheim invited Viscount Im Dohyeon to dine at Waldheim Keep. A private dinner. No retainers, no weapons. Just two landowners discussing the future of the province. The tone was warm. The handwriting was elegant. The threat was invisible, but Dohyeon could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. He showed the letter to Ashley.
She said it was a trap. He showed it to Saren. She said it was a negotiation. He thought about it for a day and decided they were both right. He told the writer he would attend. Waldheim Keep sat on a granite ridge in the northern highlands of Lin Province. It was not a manor, it was a fortress. 3 curtain walls, a gatehouse with murder holes, towers at each corner that had been built when the Waldheim family fought actual wars instead of market ones. Dohyeon rode up to it on a borrowed horse and felt very small. He had bought 6 properties in 3 months, and he still could not afford a decent horse. The irony was not lost on him. The gatehouse guards let him through without search as promised. The inner courtyard was immaculate. Hedged gardens, a fountain, servants in matching livery moving in silent formation. This was old money. Not the kind you earned, the kind that grew on you like moss on a castle wall. Lord Marcus Waldheim met him in a dining hall that could seat 50. There were 2 place settings. The lord was tall, thin, silver-haired with a close-trimmed beard and pale blue eyes that looked at Dohyeon the way a collector looks at an insect he has not yet classified. His handshake was firm. His smile was precise. He gestured to the chair across from him, and they sat. The food was excellent. Roast pheasant, wine from the southern vineyards, fresh bread with herb butter. Dohyeon ate carefully and waited. Waldheim made small talk through the first course. Weather, the eastern fortification progress, the price of grain. He spoke about land the way priests speak about scripture, with reverence, with absolute certainty that he understood its true meaning and others did not. The real conversation began over the second course. Waldheim set down his fork and looked at Dohyeon and said he had a proposal. He said that the province of Lin had always been managed by houses that understood its character, that the land had been shaped by centuries of stewardship, that there was a natural order to ownership that went beyond mere legality. He said he respected what Dohyeon had accomplished, buying distressed properties, reopening the quarry, reviving the Marindale Inn. Clever work. But cleverness without roots was like a building without a foundation. It looked impressive until the first storm. Dohyeon listened and ate his pheasant and said nothing. Waldheim continued. He proposed an alliance, a marriage alliance. His niece, Alara Waldheim, was 24, educated, from the main branch. A marriage between Viscount Im and Lady Alara would merge their holdings and legitimize Dohyeon's position in the province. He would gain the Waldheim name and the protection that came with it. The Waldheim house would gain his properties and his mysterious talent for acquisition. Everyone wins. Dohyeon set down his wine glass. He understood exactly what was being offered. In Korean corporate culture, this was called a hostile merger disguised as a friendly one. Marry into the family, pool the assets. And within a year, the Waldheim legal machinery would restructure everything so that the old house controlled the combined portfolio and the foreign son-in-law was a figurehead. He had seen it happen to 3 different agency owners in Seoul. The pattern was always the same. Flattery, generosity, then the contract fine print. He looked at Lord Waldheim across the candlelit table and saw a man who had been buying and selling people for 60 years and believed he was about to do it again. Dohyeon thanked him for the generous offer. He said he was honored by the consideration. He said he would need time to think. Waldheim smiled and said, "Of course, take all the time you need." They finished the meal with a discussion of hunting in the northern forests, and Dohyeon rode back to Lindholm in the dark,
thinking so hard that he nearly rode past the manor gate.
Ashley was waiting in the courtyard. She asked how it went. He said Voltheim wanted to buy him with a bride instead of a blade. Ashley said that was worse. Brides lasted longer than blades. Dohyeon agreed. He spent the next week preparing for Voltheim's next move. The marriage proposal was the soft approach. When Dohyeon declined, and he would decline, the hard approach would follow. Not assassins this time. Voltheim had learned that crude violence invited guild complaints. The next attack would be legal, financial, a siege by paperwork. Saren predicted 3 likely vectors. First, a challenge to one or more of Dohyeon's property titles on technical grounds. The succession dispute at Marindale could be reopened if Voltheim lawyers found a flaw in the joint sale process. Second, a coordinated effort to outbid him on any new acquisitions in the province, driving up his costs and limiting his expansion. Third, a political campaign to introduce new regulations targeting rapid property accumulation. Something that sounded reasonable, but was designed to freeze Dohyeon specifically. Dohyeon prepared countermeasures for all 3. For the title challenge, he asked Saren to audit every document in their portfolio for any irregularity, no matter how minor. She spent 4 days reviewing everything and found one potential issue. The Thornfeld timber rights reversion had never been formally registered with the guild. The rights had reverted automatically under the code when the logging company dissolved, but without a formal registration filing, Voltheim lawyers could argue the rights were still in dispute and challenge Dohyeon timber sales as unauthorized. Saren filed the registration immediately, cost 12 silver. It closed a gap that could have cost them 300 gold in clawed-back revenue. For the bidding war, Dohyeon adopted a strategy of misdirection. He began making visible inquiries about properties he had no intention of buying. He sent letters to owners of estates in the southern part of the province asking for tours and assessments. He visited 3 properties in person, with Saren carrying ledgers and maps. Each visit was noticed. Each visit was reported back to Voltheim through the network of agents and gossips that saturated the province. Voltheim would respond by placing preemptive bids on these properties to block Dohyeon. And while Voltheim's attention and gold were tied up in the south, Dohyeon's real target was in the north, directly adjacent to Voltheim's own holdings. The target was called Feldmar, a mid-sized barony with 3 villages and a significant stretch of the Highland Road that connected Voltheim Keep to the provincial capital at Ferrisport. Feldmar was owned by a minor lord named Baron Gresser, who had been Voltheim's vassal in all but name for 20 years. He paid informal tribute. He supported Voltheim positions in provincial councils. He was loyal. But loyalty had a price, and Voltheim had not been paying it. Gresser lands had been declining for years. His roads were crumbling. His villages were losing people to the cities. He had asked Voltheim for help 3 times and been told to manage his own affairs. Saren had learned this from a guild clerk in Ferrisport who handled Gresser tax filings. The clerk mentioned that Baron Gresser had recently missed 2 consecutive quarterly payments. 2 missed payments put him 1 quarter away from the tax lien threshold. Dohyeon did not wait for the tax lien. He rode to Feldmar in person. The Baron was a stout man, with worried eyes, and a wife who served thin soup because they were rationing. Dohyeon sat in their drafty hall and listened to the same story he had heard from every struggling baron in the province. Costs rising, income falling, crown taxes relentless, no help from those above. Dohyeon made his offer. Fair price, immediate payment, and a provision that Baron Gresser and his wife could remain in the manor house as tenants at no rent for 5 years, long enough to resettle, long enough to find a new path. The Baron looked at his wife. She nodded. He signed. The news hit Voltheim Keep like a siege stone. Dohyeon had bought Feldmar, the barony that sat on Voltheim's supply road, the barony whose villages provided seasonal labor for Voltheim farms, the barony that Voltheim had treated like a doormat for 2 decades. It now belonged to the foreign Viscount. Lord Marcus Voltheim received the news during his morning tea, and according to a servant who later talked to a merchant who later told Saren, the lord set down his cup so carefully that no liquid spilled and sat in absolute silence for 10 minutes. Then he called for his lawyer. The legal attack came fast. Within a week, Voltheim lawyers filed 3 separate challenges with the guild.
The first challenged the Marindale joint sale on grounds that one of the cousins had been improperly notified. The second challenged the Thornfeld timber rights reversion, claiming the logging company had been succeeded by a subsidiary that still existed. The third was the most dangerous. It challenged the very mechanism by which Dohyeon was buying property. It did not name the gift directly because nobody outside the summoning chamber knew exactly what it was. But it argued that any purchase consistently made at prices far below market value constituted evidence of magical coercion of the seller and should be investigated as fraud. It was a brilliantly constructed argument. If the guild accepted it, every one of Dohyeon purchases would be open for review. Sun Ha-yoon received all three filings. She was required by guild protocol to investigate each one. She scheduled hearings for the following month. Dohyeon received the notices and spread them on his desk, and read each one slowly.
Saren stood beside him and watched his face for signs of panic. She did not find any.
He read the third filing twice, then he leaned back and said that Vaulttime had made a mistake. Saren asked, what mistake? Dohyeon said that the third filing argued his purchases were fraudulently low, but the guild records showed the exact prices paid and the exact registry values at the time of purchase. His prices were low, but not impossible. The Baron of Lindholm had accepted 90 gold willingly. The Sergard sale was at 23 gold willingly. The Thornfeld auction had no competing bids. Every seller had signed voluntarily. The argument of magical coercion required evidence of coercion, and there was none because there had been none. The gift reduced his price. It did not force the seller hand. And more importantly, the seal itself had validated every transaction. The ancient seals did not authenticate coerced contracts. That was their entire purpose. If the guild argued that Dohyeon contracts were fraudulent, they were arguing that the seals themselves were flawed. The guild hearings took place over 3 days in the Ferrisport Guild Hall. Sun Ha-yoon presided. The room was small and smelled of old ink and leather. Vaulttime sent his senior lawyer, a thin man with a sharp nose named Aldrin, who had been arguing land cases for 30 years and had never lost one that mattered. Dohyeon brought Seirin. They sat on opposite sides of a heavy oak table, and the proceedings began. The Marindale challenge collapsed on the first day. Aldrin argued that Cousin 2 had not been properly notified of the joint sale provision. Seirin produced the original letter with Cousin 2's signature, acknowledging receipt. She produced the cousin-written consent. She produced the guild-owned filing stamp showing the date of registration. Aldrin pivoted. He argued that the premium payment Dohyeon had offered to Cousin 2 constituted an improper inducement. Saren opened the Land Code to Section 14, Article 3, and read aloud the provision that explicitly permitted additional consideration in joint sale transactions, provided both parties disclosed the terms. Both parties had disclosed. The terms were in the contract. Ha-yoon examined the documents. She ruled the Marindale sale valid. Aldrin made a note and did not look up. The Thornfeld challenge lasted half a day. Aldrin presented a document suggesting the logging company had transferred its assets to a subsidiary called Thornfeld Timber Holdings before dissolution. If the subsidiary existed, the timber rights had transferred to it, not reverted to the land. Saren asked to see the document. It was a handwritten memo. No guild stamp, no seal, no witness signatures. She asked where it came from. Aldrin said it had been found in the archives of a private notary in the capital. Ha-yoon examined it. She noted that the document bore no official registration, and that under Code Article 22, Section 9, unregistered transfers of rights had no legal standing. She ruled the timber rights had properly reverted to the landowner. The Thornfeld sale stood. The third hearing was the one that mattered. Aldrin stood and presented the fraud argument, with the care of a man building a cathedral. He laid out the pattern. 6 properties purchased in 3 months. Every purchase at a fraction of registry value. Sellers who were desperate and accepted absurdly low prices. A buyer with no visible source of wealth adequate to explain even the reduced prices. The pattern, he argued, suggested either magical coercion or an undisclosed ability that constituted fraud against the sellers, who did not know they were dealing with someone operating under supernatural advantage. It was a good argument. Dohyeon felt it land in the room, the way you feel a well-placed blow. Saren responded. She addressed the pricing first. Every seller had been free to reject the offer. Every seller had negotiated. Baron Fenholt had argued for a higher price and settled at the amount he found acceptable. Baron Sergard had made a condition about his daughter residence, and it had been met. Baroness Kessler had rejected multiple previous buyers and chosen Dohyeon specifically because of the trust structure he proposed. The tax lien auction at Thornfeld had been open to all bidders. No coercion existed in any transaction. Then she addressed the seal. Every contract had been authenticated by the ancient seals. The seals were designed specifically to reject coerced or fraudulent agreements. In 200 years of land code history, the seals had rejected exactly 47 transactions. None of Dohyeon had been rejected. To argue fraud in the presence of seal authentication was to argue that the seals were unreliable. She paused and looked at Haeyun. Did the guild wish to declare the ancient seals unreliable? The room was quiet. Haeyun sat perfectly still behind her spectacles. Aldrin opened his mouth and closed it. Haeyun asked if the complainant had any direct evidence of magical coercion. Aldrin said the pattern itself was evidence. Haeyun said she was asking for direct evidence. Testimony from a seller claiming coercion. Magical residue detected on a contract. An expert assessment of supernatural influence. Anything concrete. Aldrin said no. He had no direct evidence, only the pattern. Haeyun ruled. She said the pattern of below-market purchases was unusual, but not in itself evidence of fraud. She said the ancient seals had authenticated all transactions, and the guild would not undermine seal authority based on circumstantial pricing patterns. She dismissed the fraud complaint. Then she added something that was not strictly necessary. She said that the guild would continue to monitor Viscount Im acquisitions as a matter of standard oversight, and that any future evidence of irregularity would be grounds to reopen the investigation. It was a warning. A gentle one, but a warning. Dohyeon walked out of the guild hall into the afternoon sun and breathed. Saren walked beside him and said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, the next time he planned to buy half a province in 3 months, he should perhaps tell his lawyer what he was working with. Dohyeon looked at her. She looked back with the expression of a woman who had just argued for 6 hours to protect a man who was keeping secrets from her. He owed her the truth. He knew it. But the truth about his gift was the most dangerous piece of information in his portfolio. Anyone who knew could use it against him. Anyone who knew could tell others. And once the mechanism was public, every seller would refuse to deal with him because they would know he was paying 1%. The gift only worked on willing sellers. Willing sellers who knew about the discount would no longer be willing. His entire strategy depended on people not knowing. He told her anyway. That evening in the Lindholm study, with the door closed and Ashley standing outside, he told her about the summoning, about the gift, about the 1%. He told her about the limitations. Only land, only willing sellers, only registered transactions. He told her that the seal authentication was real because there was no coercion. The gift reduced his price, but the seller received what they agreed to. The difference simply ceased to exist. It was not taken from anyone. It was erased. Magic covered the gap. Saren listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a long time looking at the fire. Then she asked why he told her now. He said because she had just spent 3 days defending him in a hearing, and she deserved to know what she was defending. She asked if anyone else knew. He said no. She asked if he trusted her. He said he was making an installment. She did not understand the reference. He said it meant he was choosing to trust her one step at a time, and this was the first step. She nodded. She picked up her ledger and left. At the door, she stopped and said one more thing. She said that his gift was extraordinary, but the way he used it was more extraordinary. The gift gave him a discount. Everything else he had built with his own mind. The quarry, the ford, the inn, the timber, the narrows, the legal defense, the political countermove. None of that was the gift. That was him. Then she left. Dohyeon sat alone and stared at the fire, and felt something warm behind his ribs that he could not quantify and did not try to. Two things happened in the following week that accelerated everything.
The first was a message from the crown. The provincial governor of Lin province was retiring. The king had appointed a new governor, Lord Marcus Waldheim. The appointment was political. Waldheim had allies at court. The old governor had been neutral. The new governor would not be. As provincial governor, Waldheim would have authority over tax assessments, road maintenance, market regulations, trade route approvals. He could not directly seize property. The code prevented that. But he could make owning property in Lin province very expensive for one specific person. Dohyeon spent the first 2 weeks under Waldheim governorship waiting for the hammer to fall. It fell precisely where Saren had predicted. The new governor office issued 3 directives in rapid succession. The first raised the trade levy assessment threshold, which effectively doubled the levy Dohyeon owed on goods passing through his territories.
The second mandated quarterly road inspections with fines for substandard maintenance. Every road in Dohyeon Holdings was substandard because he had not yet had time or money to repair them. The third was the most surgical. It established a new licensing requirement for river passage operations. Any entity charging fees for river transit needed a provincial navigation license issued by the governor office. The application process took 60 days. During the 60-day review period, no fees could be collected. Dohyeon Narrow's operation would be shut down for 2 months. 6 gold per month in lost revenue. Dohyeon read the directives at his desk and felt the familiar cold clarity that came when someone was trying to squeeze him. He had felt it in Seoul when the building inspectors came around after a competitor made a phone call. Same game, different continent. He spread the directives on the table and began working the angles. The trade levy increase was painful but survivable. He would eat the cost and pass nothing to the merchants. Keeping merchant goodwill was worth more than the gold. The road fines he could manage by prioritizing the most visible stretches and appealing the rest through guild channels, which would buy time. The river license was the real problem. Not because of the lost revenue, because of what it signaled. Waldheim was willing to create new regulations specifically to target Dohyeon operations. If he could shut down the Narrows, he could shut down anything. The quarry could be next. The inn. The ford. He needed leverage. Real leverage. Not legal arguments or political letters. Something that would make Waldheim think twice before issuing another directive. He found it in an unexpected place. Saren had been compiling a database of every property transaction in Lin province for the past 5 years. She did this compulsively, the way some people organized bookshelves. It gave her comfort. In that database, she had noticed a pattern. House Waldheim had been quietly selling small parcels of peripheral land for the past 18 months. Nothing dramatic. A field here, a vineyard there, small enough to avoid notice. But the total was significant. Over 30 transactions. Approximately 4,000 gold in sales. Why would the wealthiest house in the province be selling land? Saren had a theory. Waldheim was cash poor. The house had vast holdings, but holding vast land was expensive. Maintenance, staffing, taxes. The quarry price war had cost them too. Running granite at a loss for months had burned reserves. The appointment as governor was partly political, but partly financial. Governors received a crown stipend and had access to provincial funds. Waldheim needed the governorship to stay solvent. Dohyeon smiled when Saren told him this. It was the kind of smile that made Ashley put her hand on her sword hilt out of instinct. He asked Saren to identify every parcel Waldheim had sold and who had bought them. She produced the list the next day. Most buyers were minor lords and merchants. One name appeared 3 times, a banking house in the capital called the Erhardt Bank. Dohyeon knew banking houses. In Seoul, they had been both his best allies and his worst enemies. A banking house that had bought Waldheim land 3 times was a banking house that had a relationship with Waldheim. Probably a lending relationship. Waldheim was selling land to service debt. The Erhardt Bank was the creditor. Dohyeon wrote a letter to the Erhardt Bank. He introduced himself as Viscount Im of Lin province. He described his holdings. He described his revenue streams. He requested a meeting to discuss potential financial services. The letter was polite and professional and contained one very specific number: his combined assessed property value of 55,000 gold. A man with 55,000 gold in assessed land was a man worth meeting. The bank responded within 4 days.
A representative would visit Lindholm at the Viscount convenience. The representative was a middle-aged man named Gerhardt, who wore expensive but understated clothing and spoke in the measured tones of someone who counted other people money for a living. Dohyeon gave him the full tour: the quarry, the inn, the ford, the narrows, the timber operation. He showed him the books that Saren kept: revenue, expenses, growth trajectory. Gerhardt was impressed. He tried not to show it, but his questions became more detailed and more frequent as the tour progressed. Over dinner, Dohyeon made his pitch. He wanted a line of credit: 50 gold available on demand for operating expenses and opportunistic purchases, secured against his combined holdings. Interest rate negotiable. Gerhardt said the bank could consider it. Then Dohyeon made his real pitch. He said he understood the bank had a relationship with House Voltheim. He said he was not asking the bank to choose sides. He was asking the bank to recognize that the province of Lin now had 2 major landowners, and the bank would benefit from having both as clients. Gerhardt's expression did not change, but his eyes did. He said he would take the proposal back to the senior partners. The credit line was approved in 2 weeks, 50 gold on demand at 4% quarterly interest. It was modest. But it was not about the money. It was about the relationship. The Erhardt Bank now had a financial interest in Dohyeon's continued success. And more importantly, Voltheim's creditor now had a reason to think carefully before helping Voltheim destroy a fellow client. It was not protection. It was friction. And in a fight between 2 unequal opponents, friction was survival. Catherine revealed herself on a Sunday morning. Not deliberately. Saren had given her light duties at the Sergard Manor, helping with accounts, organizing the library. Simple tasks that kept her busy and visible. Catherine had been quiet and compliant for 3 weeks. Then the provincial tax collector arrived for a routine assessment of Sergard. Catherine was in the room when the collector entered. The collector was a crown official. He took one look at Catherine and went to one knee. He called her Your Highness. The room went very still. Catherine closed her eyes. Saren, who was standing at the desk behind her, did not move. The collector realized his error too late and tried to stand and pretend nothing had happened. Catherine told him to leave. He left. She turned to Saren and said she supposed the pretense was over. Her real name was Caitlin Vare, 3rd daughter of the King of Vindmar, the one the court called the Spare of the Spare. 1st daughter was married to a duke. 2nd daughter was betrothed to a prince of a neighboring kingdom. 3rd daughter was the political chip, the one they kept in reserve to send wherever the alliance required. She had been told she was going to Haltgard, the northern empire, as a hostage of peace dressed up as a diplomatic bride. She had found out 3 days before the departure. She ran. Dohyeon was not surprised. He had suspected since the purse. He sat across from her in the Sergard parlor and asked what she wanted. Not what did the crown want, not what did the political situation require. What did she want? She looked at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. Nobody had asked her that before, not once. She said she wanted to not be sold. That was all. She wanted to be somewhere where she was not a line item in someone's treaty. Dohyeon nodded. He said she could stay. But staying had consequences. The crown would look for her. When they found her, they would demand her return. Sheltering a fugitive princess was not technically illegal, but it was politically catastrophic. Unless, he paused, unless she had something of her own. Something that made her not a fugitive, but a free agent. She asked what he meant. He explained the land code provision regarding royal dowries. A princess dowry included symbolic land grants assigned at birth. Caitlin had been granted a small parcel of land near the capital as part of her birth dowry.
The parcel was legally hers. Not the crown property, not the king property. Hers. Under the code, she could sell it. And if she sold it, the proceeds were hers. Her money, her autonomy. The first step toward being a person instead of a chess piece. She stared at him. She asked if he wanted to buy her dowry land. He said yes, at full registry price. His gift would not work on royal dowry because it was classified as an entailed grant, not a standard property. He would pay full price, 1,500 gold, to her, cash. Caitlin looked at the number. 1,500 gold was more money than she had ever held. More than most knights earned in 5 years. Enough to live independently for a decade. Enough to say no to any marriage. Enough to be free. She asked why he would pay full price for a small parcel near the capital that he could not even visit without drawing attention. Dohyeon said the land was adjacent to the Crown Administrative District and would be worth triple within 2 years as the capital expanded. It was a good investment. She searched his face for the lie. She did not find one because it was not a lie. It was a good investment. It was also the right thing to do, but he would never say that. Winter came hard to the province of Lin. The first frost arrived 3 weeks early and the harvest was short. Not catastrophic, but enough that grain prices jumped 20% in a week and the villages started rationing. Dohyeon felt the numbers shift under him like sand. His 8 villages had about 1,200 people in total. 1,200 mouths. A short harvest meant less surplus to sell. Less surplus meant less income for the villages. Less income meant less rent. Less rent meant less revenue. The math cascaded downward in a way that every landlord in history knew, and most tried to solve the same way. Raise rents. Squeeze harder. Take more. Every landlord except this one. Dohyeon called Saren and Ashley into the Lindholm study. He laid out the situation. The grain shortfall across his territories was approximately 3,000 bushels. At current prices, replacing that grain would cost about 200 gold. He did not have 200 gold. The Caitlin transaction had drained his reserves. The credit line was tapped. The quarry was breaking even. The inn was doing well, but 12 gold a month was not 200 gold. Timber was winding down as the best stands were exhausted. He had 60 gold in available cash. Total. Ashley said they could tighten the guard rotations and save maybe 3 gold a month. Saren said they could defer road maintenance and save another 5. Dohyeon shook his head. Those were drops. He needed a river. He found the river in the crown itself. The province of Lin was part of the kingdom of Vinmar. The crown maintained a strategic grain reserve for exactly this kind of situation. Provincial governors could request emergency grain distributions for affected areas. The governor of Lin was Lord Valtheim. Valtheim would never approve a grain distribution for Dohyeon villages. But the request did not have to go through Valtheim. Under the Emergency Provisions Act, Section 8, a landowner with holdings exceeding 10,000 gold in assessed value could petition the crown directly for famine relief. The petition bypassed the governor. It went straight to the royal treasury. Dohyeon holdings were assessed at over 55,000 gold. He qualified. He drafted the petition that night. Saren reviewed it. It was precise. It cited the harvest shortfall figures for each village. It estimated the food gap. It requested 3,000 bushels of grain from the Crown Reserve to be distributed across the 8 affected villages. It was a reasonable request. Not greedy, not political, just a landowner taking care of his people through proper channels. He sent it by courier the next morning. He also sent a copy to the Guild of Surveyors. Hyun would see it. The guild would note that a major landowner was requesting crown aid rather than squeezing his tenants. That was the kind of detail that built a reputation. The petition was approved in 12 days, faster than Dohyeon expected. The grain arrived in wagons bearing the crown seal, 3,000 bushels distributed across 8 villages. The cost was borne by the royal treasury, not by Dohyeon. But there was a catch. The emergency distribution was technically a loan to the province of Lin, not a gift. The province would eventually need to repay the treasury, and the governor was responsible for allocating that repayment across the affected landowners. Waldheim now had legal authority to charge Dohyeon for the grain, at whatever markup he deemed appropriate. Dohyeon had anticipated this. The petition included a clause that Serin had buried in Section 3. It specified that the requesting landowner agreed to repay the crown directly at the standard treasury rate of 5% above cost. By including this clause, Dohyeon had preemptively agreed to repay the crown himself at a fixed rate. Waldheim could not add a markup because the repayment terms were already set in the petition that the crown had approved. The total repayment would be about 210 gold over the next year. Manageable. The villages were fed. Waldheim was outmaneuvered, and 1,200 people would not starve this winter. The grain distribution changed something in the villages. Dohyeon had been their landlord for 4 months. They had watched him from a distance. They had paid their rent on time because the rates were fair. They had worked the quarry because the wages were honest. But they had not trusted him. Now carts were rolling into each village square with crown grain stamped and official, and the village heads told them it was the Viscount who had arranged it. Not through charity, through the law, through a petition filed in their name. Some of the older villagers had lived through previous bad harvests under the old barons. They remembered what happened. Rents doubled. Food ran short. People left or died. This time, none of that happened. This time, someone with power had used it to feed them instead of squeeze them. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of loyalty. Real loyalty. The kind that mattered when things got worse. Lily Hartwell arrived in the province of Lin on a cold afternoon in the company of a fat merchant and his wife, who had given her a ride from the Eastern Road. She was 19, blonde hair, wide eyes, a smile that arrived before she did. She carried a small bag with 2 dresses and a pouch of dried herbs, and nothing else. She had been walking for 3 weeks from her father's estate in the neighboring province. Her father was Viscount Hartwell, a minor noble who had accumulated debts he could not pay. The largest creditor was a moneylender named Theron Blask, who was 62 years old and had the face of a man who had been counting other people's misfortunes for decades. Blask had offered to forgive the debt in exchange for Lily hand in marriage. Viscount Hartwell had agreed. Lily had not been consulted. The wedding was set for the following month. Lily had run. She had heard from a traveling merchant that the new Viscount of Lin was buying properties and hiring people, and that his territories were the safest in the province, because he actually maintained order and paid his workers. She came looking for work. Any work. She knew herbs, she knew gardening, she knew how to make tinctures and poultices and the kind of simple medicines that rural people relied on when doctors were too expensive. She showed up at the Marindale Inn because it was the first Dohyeon property she found and asked Marta the cook if there was work. Marta liked her immediately because Lily had the kind of energy that made kitchens warmer, and she sent word to Serin. Serin interviewed her at Sergard Manor. Lily was nervous and talked too much, and apologized for talking too much, and then talked more. But her knowledge of herbs was genuine and deep. She identified 6 medicinal plants growing in the Sergard garden that nobody had noticed. She explained their uses with a precision that surprised Serin, who was not easily surprised. Serin hired her on the spot. 30 coppers a day, plus room and board. Lily cried. Not because of the money, because someone had looked at what she could do instead of what she was worth as a bride. Dohyeon learned about Lily from Serin's report that evening. He noted the situation. Runaway daughter of an indebted viscount, a moneylender holding the debt, a forced marriage. The pattern was familiar. He had seen it with Sergard, with Caitlin, with every person in this world who had been treated as an asset to be traded. He told Serin to keep Lily on and give her access to the herb gardens at Sergard and Lindholm. If she could produce useful medicines, that was a new revenue stream. He also told Serin to quietly find out the details of Viscount Hartwell's debt. How much? To whom? On what terms? Serin gave him the look that meant she knew exactly where this was heading. 3 weeks later, Dohyeon rode east, not to Hartwell Estate, to the town where Theron Blask kept his offices. He arrived unannounced. Blask offices were above a pawn shop. The smell of old metal and anxiety drifted up the stairs. Blask received him cautiously. He knew the name Im Dohyeon. Everyone in the region knew it by now. The foreigner who bought everything. Dohyeon sat down and explained the situation. He understood that Blask held a debt of 400 gold against Viscount Hartwell. He understood that the debt was secured against Hartwell estate, with the marriage as an alternative settlement. Dohyeon offered to buy the debt, 400 gold, full value, cash. Blask would lose the marriage, but gain his money, every copper. Blask thought about it. The marriage to Lily was not about affection. It was about control of the Hartwell estate through a family connection. But 400 gold in hand versus a marriage to a girl who had already run away was a calculation even Blask could do. He accepted. The count of Dohyeon properties stood at 7 when the first year turned. 7 territories. 8 villages growing toward 9 as new settlers arrived, drawn by the reputation of fair rents and honest work. A quarry running at capacity on 2 cutting faces. A crossroads inn that merchants specifically routed through. A river passage that had reopened after the licensing delay, with fees now collected under the new provincial navigation license that Dohyeon had obtained exactly on the 60th day. A ford, a timber operation transitioning to managed forestry as the old growth was exhausted. An herb garden at Sergard that Lily had transformed from a patch of weeds into organized rows of lavender and chamomile and feverfew and a dozen other plants whose names Dohyeon could not pronounce, but whose products sold for 3 silver per bottle at the Marindale Inn. The numbers told the story. Monthly revenue had stabilized at 160 gold. Expenses ran about 90 gold, including guards and staff and maintenance, and the grain repayment installments. Net profit of 70 gold per month. His assessed holdings were now valued at 68,000 gold after the latest quarterly reassessment. The Erhardt Bank had increased his credit line to 100 gold without being asked. Gerhardt, the bank representative, had started visiting quarterly instead of on request. The bank could smell growth, the way sharks smelled blood. They wanted to be close when the feeding started. But Dohyeon was not buying land this month. He was doing something he had avoided since arriving in Erevin. He was building a household. Not a business, a household. The distinction mattered. A business was a machine. You fed it inputs and it produced outputs, and you optimized the ratio. A household was a living thing. It had relationships, tensions, loyalties, jealousies. It needed management of a completely different kind, and his household was getting complicated. Sarin ran the operations. She had grown from a state manager into something closer to a chief operating officer. She managed the books, she managed the staff. She managed the guild filings and the tax submissions and the contract negotiations. She worked from dawn until late evening in the Lindholm study that they now shared with an invisible line down the middle of the desk. Her side was immaculate. His side was chaos. She had stopped correcting his filing system 2 months ago. A sign of either acceptance or defeat. She still kept her emotions behind a wall of professionalism that Dohyeon had learned to read the way you read fine print. A slight tightness around her mouth meant disapproval. A fractional widening of her eyes meant she was impressed. The complete absence of expression meant she was furious. He had learned to navigate these signals the way you navigate a legal document. Carefully. With full attention. Ashley held the military side. She had trained the 10 guards into something resembling a functional security force. Not soldiers, security. Dohyeon did not have soldiers, and did not want them. He wanted men who could hold a gate and patrol a road and not start fights. Ashley had given them that. She ran morning drills. She inspected the guard posts. She personally rode the perimeter of all 7 territories once a week, a 2-day circuit that she did in 1.5 because she pushed the horse harder than anyone thought safe. She ate with the guards. She slept in the gatehouse. She kept her distance from the household, except when Dohyeon was in the room. Then she was within arm reach. Always. Not because he asked, because she had decided. The distinction was hers, and she guarded it the way she guarded him. Completely. Lily had settled into Sergard like sunlight settling into a garden. She was everywhere. In the kitchen, talking to the cook. In the garden, turning soil. in the village teaching children which berries were safe and which were poison. Her herb operation had expanded faster than anyone expected. She had identified a local demand for fever reducers and wound salves that the nearest apothecary in Ferrisport could not meet because his prices were triple what rural families could pay. Lily made the same products from garden-grown ingredients at a third of the cost. Within 2 months, she had a small but steady customer base that extended beyond Dohyeon territories into neighboring baronies. Revenue was modest, 8 gold per month, but growing. Caitlin was the most difficult piece of the household puzzle. She had money now, 1,500 gold in a private account at the Earhart Bank. She could leave any time. She stayed. She said it was because leaving would draw attention, and she wanted the situation to cool before she moved. Dohyeon suspected it was something else. Caitlin had spent her entire life in the capital, surrounded by hundreds of people and utterly alone. Here, she was surrounded by fewer people, and for the first time, not alone. She had started helping with the accounts at Sergard. Her education included mathematics, and she was better at it than anyone in the household except Dohyeon himself. She and Saren had developed a working relationship that was polite and efficient and charged with unspoken tension because they were both smart women who had both noticed that they orbited the same man, and neither wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. And then there was Yuna, the girl from Lindholm Quarry. She had been a presence in the background since the first week, sitting on the quarry steps when Dohyeon arrived, running errands in the village, appearing at the manor kitchen at mealtimes because nobody had told her she could not. She was 17, thin, quiet. Parents dead in the quarry 2 years ago. No relatives. No home except the doorstep of whoever felt like feeding her that day. Dohyeon had started feeding her on the 3rd day. By the 2nd week, she was doing odd jobs around the manor. By the end of the 1st month, he noticed something. She could count. Not just count. Calculate. He had dropped a stack of receipts on the kitchen table one evening, and she had picked them up and added them in her head in about 10 seconds. 247 silver and 16 coppers. He checked. She was right. He tested her again the next day with a more complex set, revenue figures from 3 properties. She did it in her head. Right again. He started teaching her, not formally. He would sit in a study working through the books, and she would sit on the floor in the corner, watching. After a few days, he started explaining what he was doing. This column is income. This column is expense. The difference is profit. Profit goes here. If it is negative, that is bad. She absorbed it like dry ground absorbs rain. Within a month, she was doing the daily reconciliation for Lindholm Village. Within 2 months, she was handling all 3 original properties. Her handwriting was terrible. Her column alignment was crooked. But the numbers were always right. Every time. Saren did not approve initially. Yuna was untrained, unprofessional. She left crumbs on the ledger pages and hummed while she worked, and she had a habit of correcting Saren arithmetic in a quiet voice that somehow carried across the room. Saren checked her corrections. They were always right. That made it worse. But over time, something shifted. Saren began leaving the more tedious calculations for Yuna, the quarterly tax summaries, the inventory reconciliations, the work that was mind-numbing for a trained professional, but fascinating for a girl who had never been given anything to do with her mind. Yuna did it all. She did it fast. She did it right. And she did it with a look of concentration so intense that Saren once told Dohyeon it was like watching someone eat for the first time after starving. Dohyeon made a decision on a quiet evening in the 6th month. He had been thinking about it for weeks. He asked Saren to draft a document, an adoption certificate. Under the Civil Code of Vinmar, a landowner of Viscount rank or higher could legally adopt a ward. The adoption granted the ward full legal status as a member of the household, including inheritance rights and the protection of the family name. Saren drafted it without comment. Ashley witnessed it. Dohyeon signed it. Yuna Taehi became Yuna Im, legally his daughter, the only entry in his entire portfolio that generated no revenue. When Saren filed the document at the guild, she noted it alongside his property holdings. Properties owned, 7. Quarry output, 500 cubic yards per quarter. Revenue streams, 6. Dependents, 1. Yuna did not cry when he told her. She went very still. She looked at the document with the same intensity she gave to a column of numbers. She read every line. She asked if it was real. He said the seal had authenticated it. She asked if he could take it back. He said no.
The seal was permanent. She asked why. He did not have a good answer for that. He said someone should want her. It was the most honest thing he had said since arriving in Erevin, and it came out rough and unplanned, and he immediately wished he had said something about investment potential or long-term human capital development. But it was out. Yuna put the document on the table and sat on the floor next to his chair and said nothing for a long time. Then she said she would make the quarterly report perfect. 0 errors. He said he was counting on it. It became their language. A promise wrapped in numbers. A family built on ledger lines. The household dinner that evening was the first time all of them sat at one table. Dohyeon at the head because it was his manor, Saren to his right because she always sat to his right, Ashley to his left eating with her sword propped against the chair, Lily across from Saren talking about a new strain of mint she was cultivating, Caitlin at the far end, quiet and watchful, and occasionally correcting Lily pronunciation of botanical terms. Yuna next to Dohyeon on a chair that was slightly too tall for her, eating with one hand and holding a pencil in the other because she was reconciling the day receipts on a napkin. Henrik served the food. It was not elegant. The manner was not elegant. The table was scratched and the chairs did not match, and the candles were cheap tallow that smoked. But it was full, and it was his. After dinner, Dohyeon went to the study and opened the provincial map. He had been thinking about the next phase for weeks. 7 properties was a strong foundation, but it was not enough. The title of Viscount allowed him 20 armed men. To get the next title, he needed to control a defined percentage of provincial territory. The title of Count required ownership or direct administration of at least 20% of a province land area. He was at roughly 12%. He needed 8 more. And the 8% he needed was currently held by 3 owners. 2 minor barons who were struggling, and House Valtheim. He could buy the 2 barons. That would get him to maybe 16%. The remaining 4% was Valtheim territory. He could not buy Valtheim. Not from the Lord himself. But the Lord was not the only Valtheim. Saren had mentioned something weeks ago that he had filed away. Lord Marcus Valtheim had a cousin, a man named Edric Valtheim. Edric had been the second son of the previous Lord brother. He had been passed over for the headship of the house 30 years ago in favor of Marcus. He had been given a small estate in the eastern part of the province and essentially forgotten. He was 63, unmarried, bitter. He had spent 3 decades watching Marcus run the family from the big keep, while he sat in a drafty manner counting his grievances. His estate was technically part of the Valtheim holdings on the map, but legally it was his personal property, granted by deed when the family divided. He could sell it, if he wanted to. And a man who had been nursing a grudge for 30 years might want to very much if the sale hurt the right person. Dohyeon marked Edric Estate on the map. It was not large, about 2% of the province, but combined with the 2 minor baronies, it would push him past 20%. Count Im. The title would change everything. A count had real power, a standing army, a seat on the provincial council, the right to levy taxes directly, the right to negotiate with the crown as a peer. He would no longer be a clever foreigner buying scraps. He would be a lord of the realm. Dohyeon bought the first barony on a Monday. Baron Hessler of Greymarsh had been waiting for a buyer for 8 months. His land was mostly wetland and scrub pasture that flooded every spring. The registry valued it at 6,000 gold, which was generous. Dohyeon offered and paid 60 gold after the gift. Hessler signed without negotiating because he had already packed his bags for the capital, where his sister had offered him a room. The second barony took longer.
Baroness Wendell of Stonebridge was 74 and sharp as a blade, and she did not trust anyone who smiled while buying land. Dohyeon did not smile. He sat in her parlor for 3 hours, drinking terrible tea and listening to her complain about her knees and the weather and the state of modern youth. Then he made his offer. She countered. He adjusted. She adjusted. They agreed. Stonebridge was listed at 9,000 gold. He paid 90 after the gift plus fees. Total cost for both baronies came to 180 gold. His territory now covered roughly 16% of Lin province, 4% short of the count threshold. The 4% he needed belonged to Edric Valtheim. Getting to Edric was not simple. The man lived in a manor called Ashfeld on the eastern edge of the province. He had no public presence. He attended no councils. He responded to no letters from people he did not know. Dohyeon sent 3 letters over 2 weeks. All 3 went unanswered. He considered writing to Ashfeld unannounced, but Ashley warned against it. The eastern roads near Valtheim territory were not safe for someone Lord Marcus wanted dead. Dohyeon did not rush. He spent the first hour asking Edric about the estate, the soil quality, the tenant situation, the history of the buildings. Edric answered cautiously at first, then with growing detail, as he realized Dohyeon's questions were specific and informed. This was not a casual visitor. This was someone who knew land the way Edric knew land, by touch, by memory, by the weight of years spent on it. When the tea was finished, Dohyeon made his proposal. Not an offer to buy, a proposal. He said he wanted to create a regional land trust that consolidated smaller holdings in Eastern Lin under shared administration, better management, shared resources, collective bargaining with the guild and the crown. Edric Estate would be the anchor. Dohyeon would provide capital and infrastructure. Edric would provide local knowledge and the Valtheim name, which still carried weight in the east, even if Marcus had hoarded it. Edric listened. His expression did not change. When Dohyeon finished, Edric asked one question. He asked what Marcus would think. Dohyeon said Marcus would be furious. Edric almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile his face had produced in years. He said he needed to think. Dohyeon said of course. He left Ashfeld and rode back to Lindholm and told Saren that the hook was set. Now they waited. The wait lasted 11 days. Edric's letter arrived on a Tuesday. He was not interested in a land trust. Land trusts were complicated, and he was too old for complicated. But he was interested in selling, outright, the whole estate. 3 conditions. First, the price had to be fair. Not registry fair, actually fair. A price that reflected what the land meant to someone who had lived on it for 60 years. Second, Edric wanted to stay, not as a tenant, as a resident with permanent rights. Third, and this was the one that mattered, Edric wanted it known. He wanted the sale to be public. He wanted Marcus to see it in the guild registry. He wanted Marcus to know that his own blood had chosen to sell to the foreign upstart rather than let the land rot under Valtheim neglect. Dohyeon agreed to all 3 conditions. The price was the hardest negotiation. Ashfeld was registered at 12,000 gold. Edric wanted 500 gold in actual payment, a symbolic amount that said this was not a fire sale, but a deliberate choice. With the gift, Dohyeon would pay 1% of registry, 120 gold. But Edric wanted 500. The gift reduced the purchase price to 1% of registry value, but Dohyeon could pay more than the minimum if he chose. He chose 500 gold. A premium of 380 gold above the gift floor. It was the most expensive thing he had ever bought relative to the minimum price. Saren told him it was financially irrational. He said some investments were not about money. She opened her mouth and closed it, and wrote the number in the ledger without further comment. The sale closed at the Ferrisport Guild office. Sun Haeyun processed it herself. She looked at the contract. She looked at the seller name. Valtheim. She looked at the buyer name, Im. She stamped the document without expression and filed it in the registry. The seal flared. Ashfeld was his. The registry update would be published at the end of the week. Every landowner in the province would see it. Lord Marcus Waldheim would see his own cousin name on a sale deed to the man he had been trying to destroy for a year. Dohyeon combined holdings now exceeded 20% of Lin province. 9 territories, 12 villages, 1 quarry, 1 inn, 1 river passage, 1 ford, multiple timber and farming operations, an herb business, a household of 7 core members and over 60 employees. Total assessed value approaching 80,000 gold. The guild automatically processed his title elevation. Viscount Im became Count Im. The document arrived by courier 3 days later. It carried the seal of the provincial registry and the countersignature of the Crown Herald Office. Count Im Dohyeon of Lin, holder of 9 territories, commander of a household guard now permitted to expand to 50 armed men, member of the provincial council with voting rights, a lord of the realm. The news of the Ashfeld sale reached Waldheim Keep on a Friday evening. Lord Marcus Waldheim was in his study reviewing provincial accounts when the courier delivered the weekly guild registry update. He opened it to the transactions page as he always did. He read the entry. Ashfeld Estate. Seller Edric Waldheim. Buyer Im Dohyeon. He read it again. The registry page was smudged slightly where his thumb pressed too hard. He set the document down. He stood. He walked to the window and looked out over the highlands that his family had held for 3 centuries. And he stood there until the candle burned out and the room went dark. Dohyeon knew the reaction would come. He prepared for it by doing something counterintuitive. He did nothing. He did not buy more land. He did not expand his guard. He did not make political moves. He went quiet. For 3 weeks, the Count of Lin was invisible. He worked on his existing properties. He repaired roads. He expanded the quarry. He increased guard patrols. He met with village heads. He reviewed accounts with Saren. He walked his territories with Ashley. He ate dinner with his household every evening. He was building strength in the most boring way possible, by maintaining what he had. The Waldheim response came in 2 forms. The first was predictable. Lord Marcus used his authority as provincial governor to order a comprehensive audit of all Count M properties. Every transaction, every tax filing, every employee contract, every building permit. The audit would tie up Saren for weeks and cost money in legal fees and lost productivity. Dohyeon accepted it calmly. Saren had kept perfect records from the first day. The audit would find nothing because there was nothing to find. Dohyeon listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. When Waldheim finished, Dohyeon said no. Waldheim asked him to consider it. Dohyeon said he had considered it before walking into the room. The answer was no. His lands were not for sale. His people were not for sale. His position was not for sale. He had bought every piece of property legally. He had registered every transaction through the guild. He had built value where there was none. He was not leaving. Waldheim leaned back. His eyes were pale and steady. He said that Dohyeon did not understand what he was refusing. The Northern Empire of Haltgard was preparing for war, not a border skirmish, a real war. The Eastern darkness that the summoning was supposed to address was growing. The crown was weak. The king was indecisive. When war came, the province of Lin would be on the front line. And when that happened, the province needed unified leadership. One voice, one army, one strategy. 2 competing lords would mean divided defense, and divided defense meant defeat. He said he was not threatening. He was describing reality. Dohyeon heard the argument and understood it. Waldheim was not wrong about the strategic picture. War was coming. The province would need to defend itself. But Waldheim's conclusion that unified leadership meant his leadership was where the argument broke down. Dohyeon asked one question. He asked how many men Vaulttime could put in the field. Vaulttime said 1,200. Dohyeon said he currently had 50 guards, but was authorized for more, and his territories included the river passage and the crossroads, and the ford that controlled all supply routes into eastern Lin. In a war, whoever held the supply lines held the province. 1,200 men without supplies lasted about 2 weeks. 50 men holding the supply lines lasted indefinitely. Vaulttime understood the math. His jaw tightened. Dohyeon said he was not offering to fight Vaulttime. He was offering to feed him. When the war came, Dohyeon's supply routes would keep the province alive. But supply came at a price. And the price was that Lord Vaulttime stopped trying to destroy the man who controlled the food. The meeting ended without agreement, but it ended without hostility. Something had shifted. Vaulttime had come expecting to buy out a clever nuisance, and had found instead a strategic reality he could not ignore. The supply line argument was not a bluff. It was geography, and geography did not care about bloodlines. 3 days after the meeting, Dohyeon received a second visitor. This one came without warning. A man in traveling robes with dust on his boots and an accent Dohyeon could not place appeared at the Lindholm Manor gate and asked to see the Count. Ashley turned him away. He came back the next day. Ashley turned him away again. He came back a third day, and this time he said something that made Ashley pause. He said he knew how the Count had died. Dohyeon met him in the study. The man was perhaps 40, lean face, eyes that had seen things they wished they had not. He introduced himself as Rowan, a wandering mage. His specialty was chronomancy, not time travel, time sight. He could look into the threads of a person past and read events that had been obscured or hidden. He said he had been following the trail of the summoning. Every hero summoned by the altar left threads connecting their old world to this one. Most threads faded within weeks. Dohyeon threads had not faded. They were still bright, and when Rowan had looked along those threads, he had seen something. He told Dohyeon about the truck, about the night in Seoul, about walking home because there was no money for a taxi, about the truck that jumped the curb. Dohyeon knew all this. He had lived it. But Rowan told him something he did not know. The truck driver had been paid 200,000 won by a man who worked for Dohyeon's former partner. The partner who had stolen the money. The partner who had left him with the debts. The truck was not an accident. It was a murder, arranged to ensure that Dohyeon could never come back to testify, to sue, to recover. His death had been planned, paid for, executed. And in the world he had left, his body had been found on the sidewalk and buried in a municipal grave, and his name had been listed as another victim of reckless driving, and the partner had walked free. Dohyeon sat in his chair and listened, and felt something drain out of him. Not anger. He had been angry for a long time, and the anger had burned clean months ago. What drained out was the last ghost of hope that his old life had been worth saving, the last invisible thread connecting him to Seoul, to the agency, to the man he had been. That thread broke now, silently, completely. He sat in the chair and breathed, and after a long time he looked at Rowan and asked why he was telling him this. Rowan said because the threads did not fade when the hero still had unfinished business. Most summoned heroes let go. Their threads dimmed. Dohyeon had not let go because part of him was still waiting to go back. That part needed to know there was nothing to go back to, not because the world was gone, because the world had never wanted him. Dohyeon paid Rowan 10 gold for his trouble. The mage left. Dohyeon sat alone in the study until the candle died. Then he stood and walked through the manor, past Ashley at the gate, who looked at him and said nothing because she could read silence better than anyone, past the kitchen, where Lily was drying herbs by the fire, past the study, where Yuna was asleep on the floor with a ledger for a pillow. He walked outside into the cold night and stood in the village square and looked up at stars he did not recognize in a sky that was not his, and said one sentence to nobody. He said, "This is home." He went back inside and slept, and in the morning he started buying again. Chapter Summary. Lord Voltheim proposes buying out all of Dohyeon holdings, which Dohyeon refuses, countering with the strategic argument that his supply routes are essential to provincial defense in the coming war. A wandering mage named Rowan reveals that Dohyeon's death in Seoul was not an accident, but a murder arranged by his former partner. Dohyeon severs his last emotional connection to his old world and commits fully to Erevin. The next 6 months moved fast. Dohyeon stopped buying one property at a time. He bought in clusters. 3 baronies in the south of Lin in a single month, 2 estates along the river the next, a failing vineyard with soil perfect for lily medicinal herbs. Each purchase followed the same pattern. Find a willing seller, make a fair offer, sign the seal, register with the guild, improve, move to the next. His territory expanded like water finding its level, not by force, by gravity. His holdings reached 18 territories by month 18. Assessed value crossed 150,000 gold. Monthly revenue stabilized at 300 gold. Expenses grew to 160, 140 net profit per month. Serious money. The kind that made banking houses send senior partners instead of representatives. The war came 6 weeks later. 10,000 Haltgard soldiers crossed the border in 3 columns. The eastern column of 3,000 headed for Lin. Dohyeon had 4 days. He sent riders to every compact member. Lord Voltheim sent nothing. His 1,200 men stayed at Voltheim Keep. Dohyeon assembled 300 men, 50 guards, 200 militia, 50 Ferrisport volunteers. 300 against 3,000. The story spread across the continent in weeks. A man with no army had defeated 3,000 soldiers with property law. The king summoned Dohyeon to court and offered the chancellorship. Dohyeon declined. He proposed buying the crown debt instead. 70,000 gold owed to 3 banking houses. He would pay them and the crown would owe him. Lower interest, longer repayment. And as collateral, a constitutional guarantee that no future king could override the seal system. The king asked about his daughter. Dohyeon said Caitlin was safe and free and staying by choice. The king said thank you. The debt restructuring closed 6 weeks later. The guarantee was written into the royal charter. The land code was now constitutionally protected. Dohyeon also bought the summoning hall itself as part of the settlement. The king laughed when he signed that line. At the provincial council, he laid down the final blow. A deed transferring Voltheim Keep to him, signed not by Lord Marcus, but by his own estranged relatives. Edric and 3 cousins who had sold their inheritance shares quietly over 2 months. Each sale legal, each seal authenticated. Lord Voltheim read the deed. His face went white. He walked out of the chamber and left the province that evening. Sun Hyun filed the documents and then handed Dohyeon her guild resignation. She was joining his registry as head of the legal chamber. That evening, the household sat at the same scratched table. Saren to his right with a ledger open. Ashley with her sword against the chair. Yuna reconciling on a napkin. Lily talking about greenhouses. Caitlin animated for the first time, telling Lily about a botanical text. A table where no one was going to sell anyone's seat. After dinner, Dohyeon opened the map. He owned the entire province of Lin, but the map showed more. 6 provinces, 7 kingdoms, 13 free cities, and Rowan, the chronomancer, had told him the ancient seals were dying. In 30 years, every deed would dissolve. Unless someone built a system so complete it survived on trust instead of magic. The altar had not summoned a warrior. It had summoned a builder. He wrote at the top of a fresh page, Continental Acquisition Plan, Year 3. Then Saren came in without knocking and sat across from him, and picked up a quill and began writing projections. They worked until dawn. Outside, the village was waking. He said they had work to do. She said she knew. The story was just beginning.